The sky over the Dakota Territory was a merciless, empty blue, a vast and indifferent canvas stretched tight from one horizon to the other. Down below, the land was just as unforgiving. It rolled on in waves of pale grass and baked earth, broken only by the occasional jutting butte that stood like a monument to forgotten gods. It was a land that could swallow a man whole, and Elijah knew it well. He felt its emptiness deep in his bones, a hollow ache that matched the one in his soul. For 3 days, he and his steady-roan pilgrim had seen nothing but the shimmer of heat on the plains and the lonely shadow of a hawk circling in the firmament. The creak of his saddle leather and the soft clop of Pilgrim's hooves were the only sounds in a world defined by silence and wind. Elijah, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder memories, pulled the brim of his weathered hat lower. The sun was a hammer, and the dust was a constant grit between his teeth. He was heading west, though west was less a destination and more a direction away from what he'd been, away from the grey uniform, the cannon smoke, and the ghosts that whispered in the quiet hours before dawn. He'd been a soldier, and then he'd been a wanderer. Now he was just a man trying to outrun his own shadow. It was then, as the sun began its slow descent toward the jagged western peaks, that he saw it. At first it was just a smudge of movement against the uniform brown of the landscape, a detail so small his trail-honed eyes almost dismissed it. But it was persistent, not an animal grazing, not the tumble of a weed. He reined Pilgrim to a halt, the horse flicking its ears in understanding. Elijah squinted, his hand shielding his eyes. It was a person, alone, kneeling on the unforgiving ground. A cold knot of unease tightened in his gut. This was no place for anyone to be alone, especially without a horse in sight. He nudged Pilgrim forward, moving at a slow, deliberate walk, his hand resting near the butt of the Schofield revolver at his hip, a habit learned in a past life that refused to die. As he drew closer, the figure resolved into that of a woman, a native woman by her dark braids and simple buckskin dress. But it wasn't her presence that sent a jolt through him. It was what she was doing. She was digging, not with a tool, not with a stick, but with her bare hands. He could see the frantic, desperate motion of her arms, clawing at the hard-packed earth, scooping away soil and rock with a terrible, focused energy. He dismounted a respectful distance away, the silence broken by the soft thud of his boots on the ground. The woman didn't look up, so consumed was she by her task. He took a few steps closer, and the scene came into sharp, brutal focus. Her hands were raw, her fingers bleeding. The dirt she dug was stained with it. Beside her, wrapped in a small worn wool blanket, was the still form of a child. It was a grave she was tearing from the earth, a small, shallow grave for a small, still body. For a moment Elijah couldn't breathe. The vast, empty landscape suddenly felt suffocating, filled with a grief so raw and profound it was almost a physical force. He had seen death in all its horrific forms. He had seen fields littered with the brave and the foolish. But this solitary, desperate act of a mother's love in the face of absolute loss, it broke through the calloused walls he had built around his heart. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Mom," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. The woman froze. Her head snapped up, and her eyes, when they met his, were like chips of black obsidian, hard, fiery, and filled with a pain so deep it looked like hatred. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, with high cheekbones and a proud, unyielding set to her jaw. She scrambled back from the shallow hole, positioning herself between him and the bundled child, a cornered animal ready to fight to the last. "Go away," she hissed, the words tight and sharp. Her chest heaved, not from the exertion of digging, but from a rage that burned in her eyes. Elijah held his hands up slowly, palms open, showing he meant no harm. His own heart ached with a familiar weight. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of countless others whose worlds had been shattered by men who looked like him. "I don't mean you any harm," he said, his voice low and steady. "I saw you. I just want to help." "I don't need your help," she spat back. "Your kind has helped enough." The words struck him like a physical blow, and he had no defense against them, for he knew they were true. He glanced at the shovel tied to his saddle pack. It seemed a world away. "The ground is hard," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's no place to be digging with your hands. Let me help you honor him." He nodded toward the small bundle. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with her exhaustion and grief. "Why?" she demanded. "So you can tell your friends you helped a savage bury her dead before you took her land?" Elijah flinched. He took off his hat, crushing the brim in his hand, a gesture of respect and humility. "No, ma'am. Because no one should have to do this alone. Burying kin, it's a heavy burden. It ought to be shared." He looked from her bleeding hands to the cruel, unforgiving earth. He thought of the shallow graves he had dug himself, the faces of friends he had laid to rest, with nothing but a prayer and a handful of dirt. The ghost stirred. "Your boy?" he asked softly, the question more a statement of shared sorrow than an intrusion. A single tear, hot and furious, escaped her tightly controlled facade and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't answer, but her fierce gaze faltered for just a heartbeat, a flicker of vulnerability that revealed the crushing weight she was carrying. Elijah took a slow, deliberate step toward his horse, never taking his eyes off her. He untied the shovel from his pack, its worn wooden handle smooth in his hand, the metal head gleaming dully in the fading light. He didn't approach her. He simply held it out. "Please," he said, and the word was stripped of everything but sincerity. "Let me carry some of this for you." For him. The young woman, whose name was Winona, stared at the shovel as if it were a snake. It was a tool of the white man, an emblem of the world that had taken everything from her. Her brother Etu had died 2 days ago, his small body consumed by a fever that had come with the settlers, a sickness for which their medicines had no answer. Now she was alone, and this stranger, this white man with sad eyes and a heavy past etched into his face, was offering her the one thing she desperately needed: help. Her pride, her fear, her deep, abiding distrust screamed at her to refuse, to spit at him, to tell him to ride on and leave her to her sacred, painful duty. But her body was failing her. Her hands were on fire, her muscles screamed in protest, and the sun would soon be gone, leaving her to the cold and the coyotes. Etu deserved better. He deserved a proper resting place, safe in the embrace of Mother Earth. With a shuddering breath that was half sob, half surrender, she gave a short, sharp nod. Elijah walked forward slowly and laid the shovel on the ground between them, then stepped back, giving her space. He would not impose. She had to be the one to bridge the final few feet. For a long moment she watched him, her eyes searching his for any sign of deception. She found none. All she saw was a weary sorrow that mirrored her own. Finally she bent down, and her small, torn hand closed around the wooden handle. The tool felt foreign, heavy. She straightened up and looked at the half-dug hole, then back at him. Without a word, she stepped aside. It was an invitation. An act of trust so fragile he felt he could shatter it by breathing too loudly. Elijah nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the truce. He picked up the shovel and stepped into the space she had yielded. The blade bit into the stubborn soil with a satisfying crunch. The work was hard, but it was honest. He dug with a steady rhythm, squaring the sides of the grave, deepening it with practiced, efficient movements. He didn't speak, knowing that words were useless here. The only language that mattered was the scrape of steel on stone, the shared air of grief, the quiet respect for the finality of death. Winona sank to her knees beside her brother's body, one hand resting protectively on the blanket. She watched the cowboy work. He was strong, his shoulders moving with an easy power under his worn shirt. He was not like the soldiers with their cruel laughter and cold eyes. He was not like the settlers who looked at her people with fear or greed. There was a stillness about him, a quiet solemnity that seemed to honor her loss. As he dug, he created a space not just in the earth, but in the suffocating silence, a space where her grief could simply exist, witnessed and respected. When the grave was deep enough, he laid the shovel aside and looked at her, his gaze gentle. "It is ready," he said. Together they lowered the small bundle into the earth. Winona sprinkled a pinch of sacred pollen from a small leather pouch over her brother, whispering his name to the wind, a final farewell in the language of her people. And as Elijah began to gently push the soil back into the grave, covering the small blanket-wrapped form, the first cold gust of a gathering storm swept across the plains, promising a long, dark night ahead. The last shovelful of earth settled onto the small mound, a final somber period at the end of a short, tragic sentence. As if on cue, the wind shifted from a mournful sigh to a sharp, vicious snarl. It carried the scent of ice and the promise of a deep, punishing cold. The sky, which had been a clear, pale orange at the horizon, was now being devoured by a bruised, purple-gray mass that rolled in from the north. The first snowflakes, hard and granular like pellets of salt, stung Elijah's exposed cheeks. "A norther," he said, his voice low and grim, "and a bad one, by the looks of it." "We can't stay here." Winona stood unmoving, a statue of grief carved against the darkening landscape. Her gaze was fixed on the grave, as if her will alone could protect it from the coming storm. The wind whipped her dark braids across her face and tore at the thin buckskin of her dress. She was shivering, though whether from cold or sorrow, Elijah couldn't tell. "I will not leave him," she stated, her voice thin but resolute. "You won't be," Elijah countered, his tone gentle but firm. "He's at peace now, you're not. This storm, it won't spare anyone caught in the open. We have to find shelter." He looked around, his eyes scanning the featureless plains. There was nothing. No trees, no rock outcroppings, just an endless expanse of dying grass that was quickly being coated in a layer of white. But his memory, a map charted by years of solitary riding, offered a sliver of hope. "There's an old trapper's cabin, I think," he said, more to himself than to her. "Half a day's ride east of here, tucked into a ravine. Or it was 5 years ago. It's our only chance." He turned to her, his expression serious. "We have to go, now." She finally tore her eyes from the grave and looked at him. In her dark pupils, he saw a reflection of the swirling snow and a deep, weary resignation. She knew he was right. To die here of the cold would be a pointless end, a dishonor to the memory of the brother she had just laid to rest. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Get on my horse," he commanded, moving quickly to Pilgrim. The roan stood patiently, its coat already dusted with snow, its warm breath pluming in the frigid air. Elijah swung himself into the saddle, then reached a hand down to her. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. Her hand was small and cold, but her grip was strong. He pulled her up easily, seating her in front of him. The proximity was unexpected. She was stiff and straight-backed, careful not to lean against him. He wrapped the reins around her, giving her a sense of control, and clucked to Pilgrim. The horse, sensing the urgency, broke into a steady, ground-eating trot, heading east into the teeth of the storm. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving the snow horizontally, erasing the horizon and landmarks. It was a blind, numbing world, and Elijah navigated by instinct alone, by the feel of the land sloping beneath Pilgrim's hooves. He pulled his wool-lined coat tighter, trying to shield Winona with his own body as much as possible. He could feel the tremors running through her, the violent shivers she was trying to suppress. He said nothing, knowing that any words would be stolen by the gale. There was only the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves, the scream of the wind, and the shared desperate hope for survival. Hours bled into a timeless eternity. Just when the cold had seeped so deep into Elijah's bones that he began to doubt his own memory, he felt the ground dip sharply. He urged Pilgrim down into the relative shelter of a shallow ravine, and there, half buried in a drift of snow, was the dark, angular shape of a roof, the cabin. It was little more than a crude box of cottonwood logs, chinked with mud that had long since crumbled in places. A stone chimney leaned precariously, but it was 4 walls and a roof, a fortress against the storm. He dismounted, his legs stiff and clumsy, and helped Winona down. She stumbled, her body numb with cold, and he caught her arm to steady her. For a moment, she leaned on him, a brief acknowledgement of their shared ordeal. The door was frozen shut. Elijah put his shoulder to it, grunting with effort until it burst inward with a crack of ice. The air inside was stale and colder than the wind, but it was still. While he led a shivering Pilgrim into the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, giving the horse a precious handful of oats from his saddlebag, Winona surveyed their sanctuary. It was a single room, empty save for a rickety table, a broken chair, and a thick carpet of dust and mouse droppings. But in the corner was a stone fireplace, black with the soot of 100 old fires. By the time Elijah returned, she was already on her knees, clearing debris from the hearth. They worked in a shared, unspoken rhythm, born of necessity. He used the shovel to clear the snow from the chimney outside, while she gathered splintered wood from the broken chair and dry tinder from the stuffing of an old mattress ticking she found in a corner. Elijah's fingers were clumsy with cold as he struck a match. The first one fizzled. The second, cupped carefully in his hands, caught. He touched it to the tinder. A tiny flame flickered, struggled, then latched onto the dry wood, growing with a hungry crackle. A weak, golden light pushed back against the gloom, and with it came the first tendrils of warmth. They huddled near the growing fire, neither speaking, simply absorbing the heat. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of shrieking wind and lashing snow, but inside the small cabin a fragile peace began to settle. Elijah took out a strip of jerky and a hard-tack biscuit from his pack and offered them to her. She took them with a quiet murmur of thanks. They ate in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howl of the storm. Finally, with the warmth seeping back into her limbs, Winona spoke, her voice low and raspy. "His name was Etu," she said, looking into the flames. "It means son in our tongue. He was 7 winters old." Elijah stopped chewing. He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her dark, sad eyes. He simply nodded, letting her speak. "The sickness came to our village with the new road the white men built," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion, as if reciting a history she had memorized through pain. "It was a fever that burned in the chest. The elders had no medicine for it. It took my mother, then my father. Soon there were not enough healthy people to hunt, not enough to bury the dead." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "We were the only 2 left of our family. I was taking him to our cousins, 2 valleys to the south. I thought we could make it." Her voice broke on the last words. Elijah's heart twisted. He knew the stories. An entire village, wiped out not by bullets, but by a cough. It was a slower, more insidious kind of warfare. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. "Truly sorry." She looked at him then, a direct, searching gaze. "You are a soldier," she stated. It wasn't a question. She had seen the way he carried himself, the efficiency of his movements, the watchfulness in his eyes. Elijah's jaw tightened. "I was," he admitted, "a long time ago. Did you fight my people?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. He could lie. He could say he fought in the war between the North and South, which was true, but it was an incomplete truth. He met her gaze, unable to offer her a comforting lie when she had been so brutally honest with him. "I wore a grey uniform, not a blue one," he said, the distinction feeling hollow even to him. "But I followed orders. I saw things I wish I could forget, things done by men on both sides." He looked away from her, into the heart of the fire. "Being a soldier teaches you how to stop being a man. It fills you with a noise you can't ever get rid of. I left it behind, or I'm trying to." He didn't speak of the specifics, of the smoke-filled villages or the faces of the dead. He couldn't, but he gave her a piece of his truth, a fragment of the weight that had driven him out into this empty land. Winona watched him, seeing not an enemy, but a man as haunted as she was. His grief was older, more weathered, but it was there in the lines around his eyes and the quiet sorrow in his voice. The chasm between them, dug by race and history, seemed a little less wide. Here, in this tiny cabin, surrounded by a world-ending storm, they were not a cowboy and a Sioux girl. They were just 2 people who had lost everything, sharing the warmth of a fire. Outside, the wind screamed its fury, but inside a profound silence fell, a silence no longer of suspicion, but of a shared, fragile understanding. The storm broke with the dawn. It did not fade or retreat, but rather shattered, leaving behind a world born anew in silence and blinding white. Elijah rose from the hard-packed floor, his joints protesting the cold, and looked out a crack in the cabin door. The sun, a pale disk in a sky the color of washed-out denim, cast long blue shadows across pristine drifts of snow. Every gully and rise in the land had been smoothed over, softened by a blanket of white so thick it seemed to have swallowed the world he knew. The air, scoured clean by the storm, was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. He turned back to the room. Winona was already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, her worn blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She hadn't slept, he guessed, but had kept a vigil, lost in thoughts he couldn't begin to fathom. Their eyes met across the small, shadowed space. The suspicion from the day before was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared gravity. They had survived the night together. It was a simple fact, but in this land it was enough to forge a bond. "We should go," he said, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. "The snow is deep, but the air is clear. We can make good time if we start now." She simply nodded, her gaze dropping back to the glowing coals. "The camp of my people. It is near the 3 peaks that look like a wolf's teeth." She pointed vaguely to the south. 2 days' ride, maybe 3, in this snow. "I'll take you there," Elijah said. It wasn't a question or an offer, but a statement of fact. Sometime during the long, howling night, his purpose had crystallized. It was no longer about heading west, away from his past. It was about seeing this young woman, this survivor, to the safety of her family. It felt like the first right and honorable thing he had chosen to do in a very long time. A small, single step on the long road to redeeming a soul he had long considered lost. They shared the last of his hardtack, washing it down with melted snow heated in his tin cup over the fire's last gasps. The silence between them was no longer heavy with mistrust, but comfortable, functional. They moved with an unspoken coordination, preparing to leave their temporary haven. He saddled a grateful pilgrim who had weathered the storm better than they had, while she carefully repacked the few meager possessions she carried in a small hide bundle. Riding was slow and arduous. Pilgrim sank to its haunches with every step, forcing Elijah to dismount and lead the horse, breaking a trail through the thigh-deep snow while Winona rode. The landscape was deceptively beautiful. The sun made the snowfields glitter as if sewn with diamonds, and the air was so still he could hear the whisper of his own breath. Yet, danger was everywhere. A hidden drift could conceal a deep ravine. A patch of ice could snap a horse's leg. He found himself watching her as she rode. She sat pilgrim with a natural grace, her back straight, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She was a part of this land, in a way he never could be. She saw things he missed, the distant track of a snowshoe hare, the subtle change in the snow's texture that warned of a hidden creek. She would point with a gloved hand, and he would adjust their course without a word. They were a team. "You never told me your name," he said late in the afternoon, as they paused to rest the horse in the lee of a large rock formation. She slid off the horse's back, landing softly in the snow. "You did not ask," she replied simply. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. "I am Winona." "Elijah," he returned, offering his own name as a gesture of equal footing. "It's a pleasure to know you, Winona." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips before vanishing. "And you, Elijah." They traveled on, the short winter day already beginning to fade. A sense of unease began to creep up Elijah's spine. It was the old instinct, the soldier's sense that had kept him alive on smoky battlefields and in hostile territory. He scanned the ridges, the stark, snow-dusted lines of the hills around them. Nothing, just the vast, silent white. But the feeling persisted, a cold prickle at the back of his neck. It was Winona who saw them first. She stiffened in the saddle, her head cocked, listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she pointed. "Riders," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elijah followed her gaze. On a distant ridge to the north, silhouetted against the sinking sun, was a line of dark figures, a cavalry patrol. The blue of their long winter coats was a stark, unnatural blot against the pure white of the snow. There were 6 of them, too many to fight, too far to outrun in this deep powder. "Easy now," he murmured, putting a calming hand on Pilgrim's neck, though the words were meant more for Winona. "They're just on patrol. We'll let them pass." But they weren't passing. They had seen them. The column changed direction, heading straight down the slope toward them, their horses kicking up great plumes of snow. Elijah's gut clenched. He felt Winona's hand grip his shoulder, her knuckles white. He knew what she saw, the uniform that had become a symbol of terror and destruction for her people. He stood his ground, one hand on Pilgrim's bridle, the other resting near his hip, a posture of non-aggression that still allowed for a fast draw. The soldiers rode up and surrounded them, their horses breathing hard in the cold air. They were young, their faces chapped and raw from the cold, but their eyes were hard. The man in front, a sergeant with a thick, frost-caked mustache and cold, calculating eyes, dismounted. "That's far enough, mister," the sergeant said, his voice full of gravel and authority. He looked Elijah up and down, taking in his worn clothes, his trail-weary horse, and then his gaze fell on Winona. A slow, unpleasant smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, what have we here? A lone traveler enjoying the company of a Sioux squaw? You're a long way from any settlement." "Just passing through, Sergeant," Elijah said, his voice even, betraying none of the tension coiling inside him. "Trying to get this woman to her family's camp before another storm hits." The sergeant took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elijah's face. The smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of recognition, then a dawning, predatory gleam. "I know you," he said slowly, pointing a thick finger. "It took me a moment, under that beard and grime, but I never forget a deserter." He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Private Elijah Coulter, as I live and breathe. Ran from your post at Fort Laramie 2 years ago. There's a handsome bounty on your head." Elijah's blood ran cold. Of all the patrols in all this God-forsaken territory, it had to be him, Sergeant Harrison, a man whose cruelty was legendary even in an army that didn't prize kindness. A man from his own past, a ghost in a blue uniform. Winona's hand tightened on his shoulder. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the sudden, violent shift in the air. Harrison's cold eyes flicked back to Winona. "And I see you've found yourself a pet. We had a bit of trouble with her kind a while back. A village up on Willow Creek. Stubborn folk. Wouldn't listen to reason." He looked directly at Elijah, his smirk returning, full of dark meaning. "You remember that, don't you, Coulter? You were there, right before you lost your nerve and ran like a coward." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Willow Creek. The name was a brand on Elijah's soul, a memory of smoke, screams, and the smell of burning lodges that haunted his nightmares. The massacre he had refused to take part in, the final horror that had made him throw down his rifle and run. He looked from Harrison's smug, hateful face to Winona's. Her eyes were wide, her expression frozen. She was piecing it together. The soldier's words, the name of the creek, the look of sick recognition on Elijah's face. The man who had helped her bury her brother. The man who had shared his fire and his food. The man she had just begun to trust. He had been there. He had been one of them. The fragile bridge of understanding they had built in the trapper's cabin collapsed, plunging them back into the abyss of history and hate that lay between their two peoples. "Looks like my lucky day," Harrison gloated, pulling his pistol from its holster. "Bag a deserter and rescue a poor lost savage from his clutches. My captain will be pleased." He gestured to his men. "Take 'em." Elijah saw the betrayal and horror in Winona's eyes, and it was a wound deeper than any bullet could make. But he also saw Harrison's finger tightening on the trigger, and he knew this wasn't about a bounty or a rescue. It was about silencing witnesses. Harrison was a man tying up loose ends, and he and Winona were the last two threads. In that frozen moment, with blue-coated soldiers closing in and the trust of the only person who mattered shattered at his feet, Elijah knew his running was over. He could not outrun the past, but for her, he would stand and face it. The air grew thin and sharp, each crystal of ice a needle against the skin. For a heartbeat, the world was a frozen tableau. The sneering sergeant, the advancing soldiers, and the profound, wounded betrayal in Winona's eyes. That look was the final catalyst. Elijah was done running. "Pilgrim!" The name was a sharp command, a crack in the frozen silence. With a movement born of desperation and instinct, Elijah slapped his horse's powerful hindquarters. Pilgrim, loyal and startled, surged forward, not away, but directly into the flank of the nearest soldier's mount. The horse whinnied in surprise, rearing and plunging in the deep snow. The sudden chaos was all the diversion Elijah needed. He grabbed Winona's arm. "Run!" "Down the ravine." He didn't wait for her to respond. He pulled her along, half dragging her from the clearing and plunging over the edge of a steep, snow-choked gully. They slid and stumbled down the incline, the soft, deep powder cushioning their fall, but also stealing their breath, filling their boots and clothes with biting cold. Above them, shouts of anger and confusion echoed as the soldiers fought to control their panicked horses. They landed in a heap at the bottom. "This way," Elijah grunted, pulling her to her feet. He knew this terrain was their only ally. The cavalry was formidable on open ground, but in these tight, broken ravines, their horses would be a liability. They scrambled onward, their breath coming in ragged, painful plumes. The chase was a desperate, stumbling flight. Snow gave way to ice-slicked rock, forcing them to claw for handholds. Behind them, they could hear Harrison's voice bellowing orders, his rage a palpable force that seemed to chase them through the twisted landscape. "He will not stop," Winona said, her voice tight with effort, as they paused for a second behind a frozen waterfall. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire that had replaced the shock. She understood survival. "I know," Elijah panted. "We can't outrun them forever. We have to outthink them." He looked at her, at the way her eyes darted around, reading the land. The shattered trust was still between them, a raw and open wound, but in this desperate flight, a new and more primal alliance was being forged. "Is there a place," he asked, "a place a horse can't go easily?" She scanned the towering walls of the canyon, her gaze fixed on a high ridge, a narrow spine of rock that looked impassable. "There," she said, pointing. "The path of the goat. It leads up out of the canyon. It is steep, dangerous." "Dangerous is good," Elijah said. It was a grueling vertical climb. They used frozen roots and jagged ledges as handholds, the wind tearing at them, trying to peel them from the rock face. Below, the shouts of their pursuers grew closer. Elijah could see them now, dismounted, making their way up the canyon floor. Harrison was in the lead, his face a mask of grim determination. They reached the goat path, a ledge barely wide enough for one person with a sheer drop on one side. They edged along it, their backs pressed to the cold rock. The path led them to a wider slope, a steep, open face of deep, undisturbed snow leading up to the canyon's rim, the promised escape. But as they started across it, Elijah stopped dead. He looked up. Above them, a massive cornice of snow, an overhanging ledge sculpted by the wind, loomed like a breaking wave. He looked back. Harrison and 2 of his men had found the path and were emerging onto the slope below them, weapons raised. "It's a trap, Coulter," Harrison yelled, his voice echoing in the cold air. "Nowhere left to run." Elijah slowly raised his hands, pulling Winona behind him. "It's over, Harrison," he called back, his voice steady. "Let her go. Your quarrel is with me." Harrison laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My quarrel is with loose ends. You should have kept your mouth shut at Willow Creek, and you should have left the savage where you found her. Now you'll die together." He raised his pistol. In that moment, everything became clear to Elijah. He was not a killer. He had refused to be one at Willow Creek, and he would not become one now. But he was still a soldier, and a soldier uses the terrain. With a movement so fast it was a blur, he dropped to one knee, drawing his Schofield. He didn't aim at Harrison. He aimed higher, much higher. He aimed at the base of the massive snow cornice hanging over the slope. Winona cried out, thinking he meant to fight. Harrison's eyes widened in confusion. Elijah fired. The crack of the revolver was unnaturally loud in the amphitheater of rock and snow. The bullet, a tiny piece of lead against a mountain of ice, struck the cornice. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a web of cracks spread across the overhang. A deep, groaning sound, like the earth itself was shifting, reverberated through the canyon. "What in God's name?" Harrison began, but the words were lost in a deafening roar. The entire cornice fractured and fell. A white wall of snow, ice, and rock cascaded down the slope, a silent, unstoppable avalanche. It wasn't a fight. It was an act of nature, unleashed by a single, well-placed shot. Elijah grabbed Winona and threw them both flat against the rock wall at the edge of the slide. The river of snow thundered past them, its wind tearing at their clothes. It swept over the place where Harrison and his men had stood, burying them, their shouts, and their hatred under tons of white. The avalanche poured down into the canyon below, filling it with a tumbling, chaotic sea of white before finally, with a great sigh, settling into silence. A profound, echoing quiet fell over the world. The slope was wiped clean. There was no sign that Harrison and his patrol had ever existed. Elijah lay there, his ears ringing, his arm protectively over Winona. He slowly pushed himself up, breathing hard. He had not killed them. The mountain had. He had merely given it a nudge. He helped Winona to her feet. She was trembling, her eyes wide, as she stared at the transformed landscape. She looked at him, at the smoking pistol still in his hand, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of understanding in her gaze. He had used the weapon not to take a life, but to save theirs. They climbed the rest of the way to the rim in silence. 2 hours later, as dusk began to paint the snow in shades of lavender and rose, she pointed. There, nestled in a valley formed by 3 sharp peaks that tore at the sky like the teeth of a wolf, was the warm yellow glow of campfires. Smoke curled lazily into the cold air. Safety. Their arrival was met with suspicion. Men emerged from the lodges, their faces hard, their hands holding rifles. An old man with a face like a weathered map and eyes that had seen 100 winters stepped forward. "My daughter," he said, his voice deep, looking at Winona before his gaze settled on Elijah, hard and cold as iron. "Why do you bring this man here? Have you not seen enough of his kind?" Elijah stood tall, ready to accept their judgment. He had brought her this far. His part was done. He would not ask for shelter, only for their leave to depart. But before he could speak, Winona stepped in front of him, facing the elder. "This man is named Elijah," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the cold air. "I found him while digging a grave for Itu. He helped me honor my brother. A storm came and he led me to shelter. And when the blue-coated soldiers came for us, the same men who burned Willow Creek, he faced them." A murmur went through the crowd. She held up a hand for silence. "He was there," she admitted, and Elijah's heart sank. "He wore a uniform, but he did not raise a weapon against our people. Today he faced his own past to save me. He used the white man's weapon to call upon the spirit of the mountain, and the mountain answered. He is not the ghost of our past. He is the man who stood beside me today." She turned and looked directly at Elijah, her eyes holding his. He saw the truth of her words settle in, saw the flicker of understanding become a steady flame. He had confronted his demons, not in a blaze of gunfire, but in a selfless act of protection. He had found his redemption not in running west, but in turning to face the east, to face the rising sun of a new day. He nodded to the elder, a gesture of profound respect. "I will leave now," he said quietly. "I only wanted to see her home." He turned to go, but Winona's hand shot out and caught his arm. Her grip was firm, unwavering. "No," she said softly for only him to hear. "Your path was broken, mine was lost. They have led us to this place. Now we will make a new one, together." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back into her eyes. In their depths, he no longer saw a reflection of the past, but the promise of a future. Standing there, surrounded by her people, with the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky, Elijah knew he was finally home. The cowboy and the Sioux girl looked out from the camp, not at a sunset, but toward the dawn that was sure to come. True redemption is not found by running from the past, but by facing it to protect a new future. This story teaches us that even across the deepest divides of prejudice and history, shared humanity, compassion, and a single act of kindness can build a bridge strong enough to heal the most profound wounds and create a love that redefines the meaning of home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.